Marvellous. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee. Apologies, we are just a couple of minutes late starting, just while we got everybody in the room and logged in, ready to participate remotely. So as ever, this meeting is being live streamed, and you will also be able to catch up with it later if you're not watching us live on the YouTube channel. I'm just going to go through a couple of introductions. So here in the room, we have our democracy officer. We also have council officers who will be speaking to various items on the agenda, who I'll ask to introduce themselves when you contribute. And we also have some people joining remotely to help us with some of the items on our agenda. And we have also attending in person Mark Edgell from the LGA to help us when we get to the LGA report. And just as we make those introductions, I'm delighted to welcome Joe to his first meeting of Audit and Governance Committee as our new independent member. We're really delighted to have you with us, we look forward to your contributions through the meeting and outside of the meeting as well. So really glad to have you with us. We've had apologies this evening from Councillor Musson, who is unwell and unable to join us. And we believe Councillor Baker is also unable to join us this evening. So introductions done. I hope I've covered everything and everybody, and if I've missed anything, please accept my apologies. We'll move on then to the minutes of the meeting held on the 29th of June. Apologies, thank you. Declarations of interest, I forgot. So are there any declarations of interest that anyone wants to make? Councillor Cuthbertson.
Yes, thank you, Chair. It's a personal non-prejudicial interest as a member of the board of City of York Trading. I'm chair of the board.
Thank you very much, Councillor Cuthbertson. I will move on now to the minutes. Thank you. So the minutes of the meeting on the 29th of June. Any corrections that anybody wants to raise with those minutes? Everybody happy for me, therefore, to sign them? Marvellous, thank you, everyone. And is there anything that anyone wants to raise as a matter arising from those minutes? Yes, Joe.
I wasn't here, but I guess one of my contributions has got to be initially first impression around looking at some things. In looking at the minutes, I was surprised that they looked like a reassurance document, not an assurance document. There's a lot of to note things going through those minutes. There's only one item which is not to note, and an audit committee that is only noting things is not, based on the minutes, developing a relationship. And I think that comes up when you get to one of the key control documents. Again, I think when you look at the risk register about whether the audit committee is being enabled to carry out its control and oversight function around activity. And on the one item which is in here, which refers something to another committee, there is, as there is for nothing else, no specific return as to what happened to that referral. So if there was a referral from 2 meetings ago or 3 meetings ago, what assurance would you have as a committee that the matter had been dealt with if you don't have a control document which says an item outstanding from 3 meetings ago, where we talked about it 2 meetings ago, we're given an assurance 1 meeting ago, it's still not happened. So I think there is an issue around control documentation. Some of that I've discussed with a member of staff. So I don't want to go into huge amounts of detail, but I do think some of the things in terms of where the control documentation works does not help you do your task of assurance, as opposed to you're being reassured by officers that things are happening.
Thank you. That's quite an opportune moment to raise that, because as most of us know, we are losing our monitoring officer to a different role and gaining a new monitoring officer who will start later in the month. And I think that would be a really useful thing to bring up with our new incoming monitoring officer, so that we can look at how we can better manage those essentially the actions that come from the discussions and the decisions we make at these meetings, making sure that we get reports back on them. And I think that's something we can take up with the incoming monitoring officer.
So I'm certainly happy to talk to anybody, but normally there is a control framework. I worked around a number of audit committees, and it contains certain elements. And I think that, you know, local government has its own rules. I haven't worked at this stuff in local government, but I have in a number of other areas. And audit, the responsibility of an audit committee it's incredibly serious, and it's a joint role that you all have outside politics. I think hard though that is to deliver.
Thank you. Anything else that anyone wants to raise from the minutes of the last meeting? No? Okay, lovely. Thank you. And we'll certainly take that forward and make it an action for the incoming monitoring officer to look at how those actions and controls can be better managed. We next move on to public participation, and we don't have any public participants this evening, which is unusual for our committee. So hopefully we will manage to raise all of the questions that our regular public participants might have raised, and hope that we'll see some more public participation as we go forward. So we move on then to item number 4, which is Key Corporate Risks Monitor 1. And I think in looking at this, we need to reflect on the fact that ordinarily we would have Key Corporate Risks Monitor 2 very soon in the year, but because of the various impacts on our calendar, we're doing, I suppose, 1 and 2 almost together this evening. So I'm going to hand over to Helen to present this.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, that's correct. What I'm presenting to you is the Key Corporate Risk Monitor 1, but it is at a later stage and you'd normally get it in the year. So it's just the combined 1 and 2. So this is the regular monitor that you would receive, ordinarily 4 times a year. And it's in the usual format that you'll be used to. So I won't take you through in too much detail in terms of the report, but I'd highlight paragraphs 13 to 19, where I've outlined the updates that have been made to the key corporate risks this time. So those paragraphs cover the updates that have been made. And then if you refer to Annex 1, which starts on page 13, that's where you can find the detailed risks and updates that have been made to each of the key corporate risks as a result of the meetings that have been held with corporate management team and with review by portfolio holders as well. So I'm happy to take questions about aspects of the report and the annex, rather than me refer to anything specific. If that's the best way to play it.
Thank you, Helen. I propose in this instance to go through them sort of one by one, because otherwise we might all get a bit confused as to which corporate risk we're talking about. So if everyone on the committee is happy to do that, if we look at key corporate risk 1, is there anything that anyone wants to ask about, comment on in relation to this? Councillor Cuthbertson.
May I ask a question, Chair, please? And it's to do with Annex A, which starts on page 13. The second or the third heading says, sorry, the second heading says at August 2023. I mean,
Oh, it does.
I know we look
I
ahead.
I didn't notice
but I
that.
think,
Well spotted, it does, yeah.
well, it's there. It's very consistent. So I just thought we might just be
Thank
clear that
you.
it is actually for the year in which we're in.
Yes, 22,
Right, okay.
23.
Thank you.
Yes,
I'll,
certainly is.
I'll be less flippant with the next question. Thank you.
Thanks, councillor Cuthbertson. Good spot. Councillor Webb.
Thank you, Chair. So yeah, KCR 1 financial pressures, and obviously this is, well, it's going to be a huge issue over the next few months for lots and lots of reasons, and I'm quite glad that the new part in there about interest rates and the continued impact of inflation is in there. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more about other concerns around, so for example, energy prices in council buildings, for example, and you know, it's been highlighted, for example, in schools that there's been problems. Now that's an issue that will be live in all public buildings. Also, residents' sort of inability to pay council tax and concerns around that, and really concerns around sort of business rates with businesses potentially struggling, and also a downturn in our tourist sector, for example, as costs hit. So sort of what work has been done in terms of how that fits into the corporate risks? You know, what are we doing to monitor those? Where does it fit beyond just the sort of the headline inflation figure?
Well, you'll see from KCR 1, one of the controls is regular budget monitoring, and I'm sure Debbie would echo that at the moment we are doing very detailed budget monitoring to identify what the size of the pressure is in terms of energy, inflation and fuel pressures. And we would be highlighting those in the quarterly budget monitoring reports with a view to taking action during the year to mitigate those pressures. Similarly, those any pressures within schools will be identified through budget monitoring. Yeah. You touched, do you want to mention anything about monitoring or? No. In terms of, no. Going to move on to the resident from the council tax.
Yeah.
Obviously, we've got the your financial assistance. Sorry, I was talking about the council tax support scheme that we have, and also the York Financial Assistance Scheme that runs to support vulnerable customers. We've also got additional grants at the moment for called the Household Support Fund that seeks to directly support vulnerable residents with food and fuel vouchers. I think in terms of council tax and business rates, I could bring back some information about or provide you directly some information about current collection rates. That might be useful.
Go ahead, councillor Webb.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think it's from the point of view of this committee, I think it's something that's incredibly live, and I think something that councillors would probably like to be more aware of than maybe sort of the average quarterly reports. And I know that you'll be doing this work on like a daily basis, I imagine. So I don't know how best it is to feed it back to us, but there'll be certain key information that might need to come to, you know, just around the idea of actually this is going to hit really hard, and these are the key things we're worried about. There are some things that, you know, a priority list even of these concerns. And I'm not giving any actions or any answers in terms of how you action that, but I do think it's something that everyone's going to be thinking about and might be asking you all individually about. And if there's something you could put out that would maybe deal with everybody at once, that might help. I don't know.
Do you want to come back on that, Helen?
Yeah, I think that's something we can take away, isn't it, Debbie? We can see what you're right, there's lots of questions being asked, and one piece of information for one place where we're holding it would be useful. So we'll take that away.
Great, thank you. Joe.
It's really following up on what Councillor Webb was driving at, which is if you introduce into a high level control process a new element. There ought to have been a report with that, which says this is what we're including in that assumption, which would enable the members of the committee to say, why haven't you included schools, or why haven't you included organizations which are partly dependent on us even? What is the impact on organizations with which the local authority works, directly, indirectly, sponsoring, owning? There is really only a limited explanation to the audit committee. This is a big deal, and you're giving reassurance, we're dealing with it, but you're not providing the assurance information about what you're covering off. Now, I talked to one of your staff at some length. Now, did any of that get through, and do you accept some of that? Because if you did, there is really no point. I don't want to spend a lot of time going through all of my things about assurance, reassurance, whether something's a control or whether it's just passing on information kind of thing. So if that's in the system, I can just forget about it and see what happens.
Yes, the conversation's been fed back to me. So obviously, I think it was explained that I was on leave, so I'll be able to take some of those things away and reflect on. Yeah, that'd be useful. Thank you.
Excellent. Councillor Wan, was that?
No.
You, oh, sorry. You, that's fine. That's fine. I didn't want to miss you. That's all. That's all. Anything else around KCR 1? Councillor Cuthbertson and then Councillor Fisher.
Yeah. If I might just make a general observation on forward planning in financial terms, we tend to see our reaction to what is an external imposition, which we can't do much about, but we tend to retrench in that reaction rather than aim to do more with what we've got. I know Debbie will understand exactly, and probably Helen, exactly the point I'm making, but I would urge our financial experts here to impress on our organisation that if we restructure to lose staff and thus cost, we think actually the costs are not just immediate, the savings aren't immediate, because there are additional costs that take a long time to filter through the system. And I speak from slightly bitter experience of that in client companies that for whom I've done jobs over a period of time. And I would urge us to kind of take a deep breath, sit down and look at what we've got and what it can do, rather than how we can cut it and make it cost less, because costing less invariably costs us rather more and continues for a long period of time. That's a very general statement of my reasonable experience in this field. I don't hope Joe doesn't mind me making that comment, but I do think it's something that we need to work on as an authority, rather than, how can I put it, taking what might seem the obvious way, often the easy way, which in the end leaves us in a position of some risk, some further risk. I couldn't say any more. I know you know what I mean. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Cuthbertson. Councillor Webb.
Thank you, Chair. Helen, Debbie, I'm not sure who's best to answer this one. Care cap. Could you sort of outline the impact of the care cap and where that again sort of fits into this KCR? So possibly a similar question to my last one, but about a slightly different issue, of course linked into the finances again.
Yeah, we are still working through the impact of adult social care reform and the care cap. We've been doing some work on that. If I tell you that in our discussions with the rest of the Yorkshire and Humber authorities, we are all working on the assumption that it should be cost neutral, because the government should be providing us with the funding. Yeah, and you're smiling in the same way that I'm smiling. So, but our assumption should be that it's cost neutral, because that should be fully funded through the government grant that we're getting for adult social care reform. The difficulty obviously is York's got a very different care market to the rest of Yorkshire and Humber. We've got a significant number of self-funders, so it's a very, the council isn't the biggest buyer of places, so it's a different market. But the government are sending out further consultation. We've just had some in recent weeks around the various distribution methodologies they're looking at for funding relating to the care cap. So whilst on the one hand, I'm saying it should be cost neutral, I absolutely recognise that adult social care reform is an enormous financial risk to the council. And so I think we have, did we say Helen KCR 11 or somewhere, we had started to build that in somewhere.
That's external market conditions.
Oh,
That's what I
right,
expect
yeah.
to see it.
So we have started to talk about that in terms of the risk to the council. So I recognise it's a risk, but it should be funded by government.
Follow up on that. We all know that York doesn't tend to do well out of funding formulas in lots of different fields. So what, you know, whose job is it to make that argument to government or minister or whoever it is?
Yeah, we're working again as a region. We had a meeting last week with the 151s from the region and the DASs, so the Directors of Adult Social Services for the region, met to just talk about what the various impacts potentially are on different authorities. And so I'm hopeful through that group, through ADAS and the regional group, we'll be able to do some work on that. So I will take that away and just double check that we are that we will be lobbying and responding to some of that consultation.
Great, thank you. Councillor Fisher.
Yeah, I could have probably brought us under KCR 7, but it's probably more financial. This council has a fairly substantial capital programme, and obviously we've had to borrow fairly heavily on some to do that. First, can I just check? I think, as far as I can recall, all our borrowing is at a fixed rate. Is it not? Is that correct?
Well, in that once we've undertaken the loan, once we've taken out the loan, the borrowing, the rate doesn't change. So we take it out.
Right.
So each loan is at a different rate depending on
Yeah.
market conditions that day. But
Thank
yes,
you,
once
but
we've
it's fixed
taken it
over
out.
the term of the loan.
Yeah.
Obviously, we've had in the past a profile of our borrowing requirements. Do we have any very significant exposure to any borrowing that has to, new borrowing that has to be taken out, which could be at significantly higher rates, or are we fairly clear for the next few years as far as major loans are concerned?
We so our borrowing profile we haven't actually undertaken any borrowing this year, have we? That we plan to do, just because the pandemic kind of slowed down the capital programme, as you would expect, and we've had other sources of funding and so on. So I think we can probably answer that question a bit more fully at the next when we bring the Treasury Management mid-year review to you, which I think will be November. Yeah, be November's meeting. So that we can just go through some of the borrowing there. It's difficult. We're making an assumption about borrowing this year. We do keep an eye on interest rates, but as we've discussed at this committee before, that cost of carry versus, you know, so yeah, you could borrow today because you think interest rates are going to go up, but then you're paying the interest rate on that loan for money that you don't actually need. So we kind of weigh all that up. So we do keep an eye on it. We have Treasury advisors who also support us in that. So we keep an eye on that to just try and get, I mean, it's an art rather than a science, but we do keep that under review. But there are no big peaks and things it's all kind of smoothed out. So when we do need to borrow, we slot it into where we've got a gap in our borrowing profile.
Thank you. Could I ask another question if possible? I saw an article in the LGA about 23 southeastern councils which are already looking at the possibility of issuing a Section 114 notice. I believe a couple already have. Clearly, council finances have been hit exactly the same as family budgets have. Has there been any inkling of any support for councils coming from central government? And has the LGA, have we approached the LGA to lobby them to do something? Because at the end of the day, you know, we are hit with a double whammy. We've got massive increase in fuel bills. We've got significant increase in pay beyond what we expected. And at the same time, we're facing loss of income from tourism, council tax, and so on, and business rates in particular, because I think a lot of small businesses are really, really struggling. I speak from personal experience on that from a family member. I just wonder, is there any lobbying going on, and have we had any response from central government?
There's no lobbying going on directly from the council, although we are part of a number of regional groups that contribute to some of those. You'll remember perhaps that we were part of the fairer funding group for the kind of 20 authorities where we had the lowest core spending power per head in the country. I think York was the lowest. So it's a title you don't really want to have, isn't it, I guess? But so that's kind of ongoing. We haven't done anything directly, and given the kind of national political situation, obviously it's been pretty light on announcements lately. So I've not had any inkling of I mean, I'm not optimistic, but I'm a local government accountant, so I'm never going to be optimistic. But I certainly haven't had any insider knowledge or seen anything come. I think they're fully aware of the pressures that local government is facing. They can't not be, but I guess other challenges. So I think we'll have to wait until the settlement, probably in December, before we get anything really. And I'm not clear whether some of the expected energy announcements and national insurance announcements, if they go ahead, will help us. I don't know whether that'll just be for domestic rather than, I don't know whether anybody else has got any more information on that, but we've not had anything.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. Anything else on KCR1, Joe?
Just in the context of the discussion, one of my biggest worries is a discovered problem because somebody else goes down. You know, we rely on so many other organisations and we support so many other organisations, which in turn, we then rely on the services they provide. And if any of those turn out to be particularly vulnerable and have particular problems, social services, libraries and museums, you know, you name it, there are lots of other organisations out there. And it's having good field coverage about, you know, what kind of problems they may be having, which might actually, you're going to have decent controls on your internal stuff. You've got an effective group of staff, you've got detailed monitoring, but some of the people that we rely on, you just won't have. And that even goes out to things like the care homes and that whole sector. There are all sorts of potential discovered problems. So if there were ever a key risk at the moment, I think it's other people.
Yeah, we do monitor closely what we call our key suppliers, whether by value, just because we spend a lot with them, or because it's such a vital service, like you say. So I actually haven't been briefed on that lately, so that's a good point. And we'll just go away and check that is up to date. So contract monitoring is absolutely vital during this period. So making sure that you're aware of any issues and potential problems. So yeah, that's a really good point. I will just go away and do a check on that. Yeah.
Lurking around.
Joe, can you just make sure you're using your microphone? Because of the induction loop and the live stream, we need those on. Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to KCR2. Anything anyone wants to raise on KCR2? No? Good. Okay. We'll move on to KCR3. I'm going to skip quickly through the ones that aren't changing. 4, 5, no. Okay, KCR6 is the next one where we've got a change. So is there anything anyone wants to raise on that? No. KCR7. No. 8. No. 9. Again, we've got a change in KCR9. So if we've got anything, Councillor Webb.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so on KCR9, it's specifically the changes. So we've got revised dates been added to the 2 actions, which were recruits to the access officer role and approved financial inclusion framework. So is the reason that the dates have been changed because we haven't appointed an access officer role? What are our interim procedures really while we don't have that post filled, given, you know, the very live public interest in this particular issue across the city? And then I suppose on a wider note, what are the risks of not filling this post, and what are we doing to plan for that eventuality? I hope we don't get there, but you know, what are we going to do?
I think I would probably have to take that away back to Pauline Stutchfield just for more detail. I am aware that there's an advert due to be published for recruitment to the role, which I've seen recently. So I think I'd rather bring something back to you from Pauline direct about those points. That's okay.
Perhaps we could have some feedback circulated to members as soon as you get back, because I wouldn't want us to kind of wait till the next meeting.
That's fine.
If that's all right. Brilliant. Thank you, Helen.
Can I just, sorry, it's Helen Whiting.
Hi, Helen.
Hello there. Sorry, I'm talking from the from the speaker as such. I can give a little bit of an update on Access Officer if you would like that, Chair.
That would be really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so the Access Officer was advertised initially and we didn't get any suitable candidates. It is, as Helen has just mentioned there, it's advertised, it's going to be advertised tomorrow. It's going to be launched. So I've been working with Pauline and we're actually doing a headhunting exercise for that. We're doing quite a different approach into how we can recruit to that. In the interim, we have actually had some work done by an access consultant to help us with some of that work. So it's not as though all of the work has been put to one side. So things have progressed. It hasn't been just because an access officer hasn't been appointed, work hasn't actually progressed. I haven't got all of the finer details of that. Legal services have been working with the access consultant as well as place services. So there's elements there. Sorry, I don't have anything about the financial inclusion framework. That would have to come from Pauline, but I just thought it would be useful for you to know that we are certainly progressing the access officer and there's an access consultant in place at the moment.
That's great. Thank you, Helen. Councillor Webb, did you have a supplementary?
Yeah, thank you, Helen. You made me jump slightly by speaking, but thank you for that. Is there a time frame then around this sort of recruitment procedure? We got an idea about when we're going to appoint an access officer, for the simple fact that I assume having a sort of a consultant, not on the payroll to a certain extent, but that's something that is an additional cost, I imagine. So any details around how long this is going to take?
The advert is going live tomorrow. We're running with a 3-week campaign, but we're going to be working quite dynamically through that period and we'll actually be engaging with anybody who applies during that time. I'm hoping that the actual recruitment process can be dealt with quite swiftly within about a 5-week, and it sounds long, but about a 5-week period. But in terms of the consultant, they're not engaged on a full-time basis. They are doing ad hoc pieces of work for us. So it's not a case that they are simply employed full-time for us right the way through. And obviously, if we do get somebody as an access officer, we would be bound by whatever time that they can come to us if they're working for another employer and have to give notice. So we're working as swiftly as we can and to try and do it as quite in a dynamic way. So we can certainly keep you up to date with that.
I've got Councillor Webb with another supplementary and Councillor Fisher.
Yeah, apologies. Just one more from me, Helen. In the previous appointment procedure, which didn't work because we didn't appoint anybody, did we have any interests? Were there any particular concerns that even people who thought about becoming candidate raised? Or is there anything that you think that was putting people off?
No, I don't. I genuinely don't. I think it was we maybe didn't advertise quite as far as we could have done. So it was a case of that. And we did have some candidates apply, but they didn't have sufficient experience. So it's being looked at in a different way. And that's why we're doing the recruitment process in a different way. So we've learned from that. But in terms of have we done anything wrong? No, not as such. We just need to market it. I've talked before here in terms of recruitment challenges, and that's one of obviously the risks on KCR 10. That we have got quite a tight recruitment challenge at the moment. So it is about doing things differently, and it's quite a niche and quite a specialist area as well. And we obviously want to appoint the right candidate for York as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. Councillor Fisher.
Well, thank you. It's a new point. Has anyone else got any supplementaries or? Nope. I don't think I would get away without saying this because I've said it before, but I am somewhat concerned in something that says communities which deliver services. There's no reference in this to parish councils. And I do think we ought to have a reference about our relationship with parish council. We have a parish charter, which is a good document. It isn't always complied with, and there have been several recent cases where it isn't. I do think that the relationship between the city council and the parish councils, and I say this as the chair of a parish council, is critically important. I think it should be reflected in here to ensure that we do something about ensuring that our relationships between the two organisations, two tiers of government, are well managed.
Debbie, do you want to come in on that?
Just what, Councillor Fisher, what risk what risk are you alluding to in terms of the relationship with parish councils? What's the risk?
Well, the main risk is reputational, I would say, because if people in the parishes feel that they're not being listened to by City Council, the parish charter which we have is not being complied with, there is reputational damage, and I think that is a risk.
So there's a reputational risk that the council's not adhering to the charter that is put in place. Right, okay, thank you.
Thanks. Anything else on KCR 9? Anyone? Okay, KCR 10, that's another one that has a change. Anything anyone wants to ask or raise? No? KCR 11? No? And KCR 12? Councillor Webb.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I can't believe that we're genuinely talking about potential commercial power outages over the winter months, and it's just mad. But I mean, could you, in a bit more detail, explain what the real risk to the council is here? What's the worry when we talk about potential commercial power outages? What are we thinking about? How did this get on to this KCR, I suppose, and you know, how was it highlighted? Why was it highlighted? I mean, it's a terrifying thing, but yeah, what's the concerns there?
The background to it being added onto the risk register was the corporate director of Place had raised it in relation to Your Waste, and some information that they'd been given around preparing for the potential for rolling power cuts. So it was in particular in relation to Your Waste that it was brought to our attention, but I guess it could be across other services. So we're not, it's just a risk. And I think the government had outlined something, hadn't they, about planning for winter power outages as well. So
Yeah. I think there might have been a rumble of thunder to accompany your response there, Debbie. I don't know if that was planned or not. I think I've got Councillor Fisher first and then Joe. I think that was the order.
Thank you. I mean, this is a follow-up to that, because I read a report in a scientific magazine which was saying that although Liz Truss has said that she can rule out energy rationing and the type, they were pointing out that she has absolutely no control over that whatsoever. If we get a period of high pressure when there is little wind energy and the temperature drops very low, we are going to run into an energy deficit, and there is nothing a Prime Minister can do about that, because there is a limit to how much energy we can generate. So we are going to, it's a serious risk that we'll face power cuts. And this will hit productivity. It'll hit things like traffic lights, because traffic lights could be cut off and the various other services. This is a serious risk, and we shouldn't underestimate it. I'm not going to ask a question, but it's just a statement of fact.
Thanks, Councillor Fisher. Joe?
It's two related things. The first one is, if there is a new item added as a one-liner, there really ought to be a report to the audit committee which says why it's being added. Same incidentally if it's being taken off, possibly, unless it's been just dropping down the agenda steadily and it's just time it disappeared. So there is one thing on here which shows us a risk score of 6 or something, which, you know, at this level it's de minimis, but if something new is added as a term, it would be helpful to have it there. And the other one is because of my peculiar background with a lot of time in the health service, which is when you start talking about reduction in life expectancy, there is an argument that people are better with a shorter but healthier life than a longer and miserable one. So quality of life, so if you take the floods that we had in 2015, that did a huge amount of damage to a lot of people's quality of life. It did not necessarily shorten their life expectancy, but it did not give them a miserable time for a long time. And some probably are still having that now. So I think some implications are chronic for the living, not acute for the no longer living sort of thing.
Thank you. Councillor Webb?
It's a mildly terrifying outlook, Joe, but there we go. I suppose back to the point about commercial power outages over the winter, and almost following on from what you said there, Joe, it almost needs, maybe within this register, because I don't necessarily think that talking about the detail of what happens with your waste or anything needs to come to this committee, but if there was a note to say, and this is being fed back through the relevant scrutiny committee or an executive member is, whatever that is, might be the right thing for this document. I think when it's something like that, where it's hard to see, you know, what exactly we can do to mitigate this risk. But if there was something that said, we don't know what we can do yet, but we are looking into it, and this is who's looking into it. Just even that might be something that I think would work from an audit and governance point of view.
Thanks. I can see Furious nodding there, so we'll
Yeah, we've got some helpful comments from Joe that we will take you up on that offer, Joe, to come and talk to you about, and we've got a lot of feedback about how we can improve both the presentation and the additional information that the committee might need. So we'll we can't guarantee we'll get it exactly right next time, but hopefully we'll move a bit further towards what you need and make some progress over the coming year.
Thank you. Okay, so that means on this, we've got more thunder. It's because you started talking about power outages, Councillor Webb. The weather is responding. So in terms of our recommendations, there are a number of things that we've asked to see around KCR 1, KCR 9. Some of the KCR 1 might tip into KCR 11 as well in terms of the external market conditions, and then KCR 12 that we've just covered. So hopefully we will have all of those that as Debbie says, we can make progress on in future monitors when we look at the key corporate risks. Is there anything else anyone wants to raise on this item before we move on? We all happy? Good. Okay. Go to agenda item 5 now, and Mark is here to assist us with this. Agenda item 5, this is going to be something that we will return to lots. This is the embedding good governance, which is essentially all of the things that we are doing in response to some of the recommendations that came out of the Public Interest Report Action Plan. It is right that we see this as a long-term endeavour to embed good governance in the council. It is right that we see it as something that reaches beyond the kind of immediacy of the action plan, and we're very grateful to the LGA for supporting us in this learning. So I'll hand over to you, Mark, and then I'm sure there will be some questions for you.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. I think I came to this committee I think that's December, and I think there's been some changes of membership, or some change of membership in the committee, as well as a new chair. Congratulations on the new role. I think you asked the LGA, or the council asked the LGA, to offer some assurance on the work the council was doing against the report in the public interest that the City Council got back in May 2021. So I suppose the first thing I should remind you of is that reports in the public interest are a pretty rare thing. Yeah, in fact, extremely rare thing. So between 2016 and 2019, no council in the country got a public interest report. I think around the time that you got yours, there were around 4 in the country. City of York Council, one of them, Nottingham City Council, another, Croydon Council, another, and I think the other one was Northampton Borough Council. So they are a rare thing. And so I'm pleased that the council are taking this seriously, and action against the public interest report seriously. What we agreed to do was to look at this in 3 ways, or 3 stages, I suppose you can see it. And that's what I've got under item 2, scope and focus. So we first looked at whether the council had appropriate actions and plans to deal with the recommendations coming out of the public interest report. And that was a report I presented back in December last year, which said broadly yes, 1 or 2 areas you may want to think about, but broadly yes, you have got the right actions in place. But I will come back to one big gap when I talk about the gap this time as well. The second stage is this stage I'm doing today, which is really, well, have you carried out those actions and plans to try and deal with the issues that were raised by the interest in the public report, in the public interest. And then the third bit is probably going to be the most interesting thing, which is the so what. So you've done all those, you plan to do all those things, you did all those things. So have they made a difference to the culture and the behaviours within the city council? So that report will come to you. I'm planning at the moment around about December this year for that. And to arrive at that report, we'll come on site for a day and we'll have a talk to some people about some of the issues of the public interest report and some of the actions that you've undertaken, some of the relevance around that and what people feel about those sort of things. So at 3, what I've done there is just to recap, particularly for new members of the committee, what we looked at last time and what our conclusions were. But if I move straight to item 5, actually item 6, I think really. So that we basically conclude that you have, on the whole, carried out the actions you plan to carry out in an appropriate way. So in other words, you have made good efforts, or the City Council has made good efforts to carry out what it intended to carry out in response to the public interest report. However, there are 5 areas that we think you should think more about. And I guess they're on the following page. Item 1 and 2 are quite specific, because what you plan to do is basically to change some policies, refresh some procedures, be very clear about those things, make sure people are aware about those changes. And that included quite a bit of training as well for individuals. So the first 2 are questions about whether you have carried out some of the training, mandatory training, you called it, you plan to carry out. The first thing is around the new constitution, which the City Council agreed, I think, in May this year. There were plans to implement some training around the new constitution, but as far as we're aware, that hasn't happened yet. Obviously, there's going to be a new council in May 2023, so you may be waiting till then. That may be the right answer, but it does look appropriate as you're operating in that new constitution now for a full year to do some of that mandatory training during this year. The second one is around the code of conduct. Obviously, you did have a new code of conduct implemented last autumn. You did do some training around that new code of conduct, but your action plan said it was going to be an annual training exercise. So I think we're around about August, October now, aren't we? I don't think that's currently planned to be done. Again, you may be waiting for the new council in May 2023, which may again be the right answer, but I think you need to be clear about what your plans are around that annual training on the code of conduct. The third area was about whether you'd taken specific steps around addressing conflicts of interest. So you had got this new guidance provided with to all members at all meetings. So I guess there needs to be some demonstration that you're learning from that. Is that working? You know, what sort of evaluation have you done to see if that is actually working or being effective or not? And we did suggest you may want to have some sort of regular review of the declarations of interest made by members. We don't think there is currently an arrangement in place to do that. The 4th and 5th areas are probably more general comments about the culture and behaviours and the nature of working in the City of York Council. The 4th one is really about the role of the monitoring officer, and I think you've just, you're just in the process of changing between monitoring officers. And I think a lot of what the public interest report talks about and implies, and some of the other issues that we've seen, I think, as the LGA in the City of York over the years, has been about the way the role of the monitoring officer has been supported, recognised, or has been quite squeezed and challenged and hassled to some extent. So I think there is a need for some members, some elected members of the City Council to think differently about the role of the elected member, and maybe other statutory officers as well, I don't know, but particularly the monitoring officer in this case. And also we think other members of the CMT showing that support and encouragement of actually sticking together to make sure that the advice that members need to hear is being heard by elected members and is being allowed to be delivered to elected members. And the last one, item 5, is a very number 5. There is quite a general comment, but it's we see a lot of mechanistic actions within the action plan. You know, change the policies, change the procedures, training, development, all that sort of stuff. What we don't necessarily see is anything specific to address sort of underlying cultural issues at the City Council. I suppose in a perfect world, those things you're doing about the Constitution, code of conduct, behaviours and things like that will create a much stronger and better and more positive culture. But we suspect they probably won't. So we do think you need to consider what other actions you need to put in place to ensure that you can deal with some of these cultures that particularly have led in the past to inconsistent adherence to policies and guidelines. So that's really where we are at this stage. And what I've done after that is what we're going to do at stage 3, at item 7 and item 8. And at item 9 there, I've just repeated the sorts of lines I put in the December last year report, which I think the peer team are going to be feeling are going to be some of our main recommendations as we get to December this year, because they are things that have consistently come up through our thinking and talking about this work we've done at this stage and the previous stage, but they also still reflect issues that come out of the public interest report and some of our other peer work we've done in York over the years.
Thank you very much, Mark. Do you have any questions, comments from members? Councillor Fisher.
Thank you. I was interested in your recommendation 9.1, members consistently behaving in line with the members' code of conduct. Now, I sit on the standards committee, and there have been almost no upheld complaints against city councillors. Indeed, when I sit on committees, I often see members of council declaring the most tenuous code of conduct things, which I personally wouldn't have bothered to declare. I think actually, from what I've seen, members are more than scrupulous about declaring interests in committees. I mean, I don't think I've ever sat on a committee when a member has not declared an interest they should have done. Further point, I've actually been told a standards complaint issued against me personally for declaring an interest when the resident didn't think I should have done.
Thanks, Councillor Fisher. Mark, any thoughts on that?
No, I think, as I said, in the third stage of this piece of work, we're going to come on site to talk to some councillors and some officers and other people about what difference some of these changes that have been put in place have made. And that may well be one of the conclusions we reach from talking to other people if they have a similar view to you about the differences, the difference that these new sort of clearer procedures around declaring interests have achieved. Yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Webb.
Yeah, it's just a follow up on that point, if I could, because I was going to ask a similar thing really about sort of, and I'm not defensive in any way about this one. Really, it's more sort of what sort of examples would you be looking for to see if members are consistently behaving in line with it? Is it as Councillor Fisher has outlined, or is there any other mechanisms that you're looking at or would be looking at?
It's a good question. Sort of trying to sort of define what success is or otherwise. So when we come on site, so some of the conversations will be with officers, for instance, for them to give a view, which is not the same as evidence necessarily, give a view on whether they feel members are listening to them, whether they feel they're able to give the advice they need to give, whether they feel they're being treated with respect by members, all those sorts of things. In other words, consistent with the code of conduct and the member and officer protocol and stuff like that. Okay, so we will just take the view of officers and say that's the truth. We'll try and triangulate that with other evidence about the way that you perceive the way you're behaving, not you personally, but generally members and also other colleagues as well, and maybe some stakeholders as well about how they feel behaviours, the culture has changed over the time or not, as the case may be.
Joe.
Not a council. I have no axe to grind about how evil they all are and how they mistreat officers. I have no experience of this. I have heard something of councillors being brought in front of the tribunal effectively, and it's a difficult experience for an officer. But that's very subjective and very personal. From your perspective, are there not some broader general principles that you could stick down on a piece of paper which are not York related, but which are exemplifications of good practice, which could then be taken into account? If this weren't a local authority, you'd be looking at things like having senior independent directors, people that could be gone to. Can the local authority have, should they have certain senior councillors who are identified as, behind the chair ways of holding discussions? Because it's often down to a personal breakdown relationship. Are there measures about recruitment difficulties? Is it getting easier to get senior officers and to hang on to them? What's the local authority's reputation like? How many people apply for a job now compared to how many applied for them 2 years ago. What are the measures which the council could have? Because there's no point doing a snapshot. You've got to monitor this thing for a little while. So what kind of information structural things can be put in which will enable relatively easier? You know, you can talk to the current officers, they've stayed, but why haven't the new ones arrived? Why haven't people applied for jobs? Is it related? Are there any structural lessons you could bring from somewhere else which said, well, yeah, here are some ways other people handle difficult relationships or difficult situations?
I suppose there's a number of things to say to that. So the council has the city council has a code of conduct. Every council has that. The LGA has produced actually a model code, and I think your code broadly, well, in fact, entirely follows that, I believe, which is good practice in itself. Yeah. So you have a member officer protocol as well, which talks about the way that members and officers should behave with each other and all that sort of stuff. They're all based on the Nolan principles. Yeah, which we know are very important. Okay, and
yeah, it's just the making it work, the theory and the practice.
Joe, if you just let Mark answer and then you can come back in.
That to some extent, Joe, is where we think there probably is a gap in terms of the current actions and plans. Okay, so there is some training around the code of conduct, but I guess it's to what extent that is actually enabling members and officers to understand how some of them may need to behave differently in the future than the way they're currently behaving, because that's what the code of conduct and the member officer protocol is saying to them. So that's all that third stage, I guess, about so what difference has all that training actually made and development has made. If not, we may recommend they actually need to do some further work, maybe between senior members and officers or something like that, or maybe between all members and officers, to try and get that understanding of how the other side sees them to some extent, try and break down some of those barriers. In some councils, the culture is there's a lot of code of conduct complaints. Yeah, okay, and that often points to a culture which is beginning to break down because people are just trying to fight fires with each other. Some of the better councils probably don't have any code of conduct complaints because the groups will sort out some of those issues themselves, or individual members will be reinforcing each other's behaviours and pulling their colleagues up when things happen. And the same with officers, I guess, you know, doing that for officer colleagues, or indeed having the strength and ability to say to members when they've overstepped the line. So I guess I would often argue that if there's a high number of complaints going in about elected members, for whatever reason, then that's often a sign of failure, because the business as usual is not sorting out some of those issues.
Did you want to ask a supplementary question, Joe?
Sorry, I'm not coping very well with the system.
That's quite all right.
I think the thing you said at the end, teasing out this thing about, it's actually the political groupings to some extent, which should really be keeping an eye on what's going on, because the members are a body corporate, but they are part of individual groupings. And rebuild, if trust has been destroyed, and I don't know because I haven't been around, if trust has been destroyed, it takes a very long to bring it back. If it's been damaged, it still takes quite a while to restore it. And sometimes getting some external view, you know, is the organization internally able over 2 or 3 years to continue working through this stuff, or will it continue to need some external help?
Thank you, Joe. And I think that is why this is going to be a long-term piece of work, and it won't finish when, you know, the LGA deliver their final report. This is something that we will continue to look at as the Audit and Governance Committee in terms of embedding the good governance, because it can't be something that just stops because we finished the action plan and the LGA have given us their report and that's all fine then. And I think there is an acceptance of that, and it will be a priority for the incoming monitoring officer to ensure that goes forward. Councillor Fisher, did you have a supplementary as well?
I was going to say that the number of intergroup complaints is actually relatively low on this council, although I should point out I'm the subject of 2 of them at the moment, just for clarity.
Thank you, Councillor Fisher. Councillor Webb.
Thank you. We've talked quite a lot here about sort of concerns around issues with member versus officer protocol, or the interactions between members and officers. And I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of the narrative as to how we've gone from a public interest report, which was around the payout of the former chief executive and whether or not the leader of the council declared an interest or not at the right time, to this discussion really about concerns between the officer-member relationship. Because obviously the PIR is what sparks it off, but actually this is really sort of slightly different tone to it. And I think that the stuff we said earlier on about I can't remember the phrase you used, but the sort of the managerial, we've made a new form, we've done this, we've done that, almost dealt with the first part, the actual PIR issue, slightly better, or at least we hope it does. But now we seem to have moved on to this member officer gap. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how we've gone from one to the other.
I think there's a natural progression between those issues. So the report in the public interest was very much about governance and conflicts of interest. It was about record keeping. It was about failure to follow due process. And so implied within that is some issues about sort of the way that maybe officer advice was not being heard and listened to. And that is a fundamental breakdown, isn't it, between the roles and respect between members and officers, I think. So I think that's a natural progression to move on from what I referred to as sort of the mechanistic response to the public interest report and doing all those things, which, as you rightly said, you hope will deal with the original issues behind the public interest report. And me saying, well, are you sure? Or the team saying, are you sure? So what? How can you be certain that that scenario will not happen again, or there will not be some similar scenarios happening again if you don't deal with some of these fundamental issues about, for instance, respecting the monetary officer role and actually hearing the advice that is given by that individual.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, you said earlier on, and I might be paraphrasing slightly here, but you said some elected members need to think differently about the monitoring officer. And you mentioned about CMT sort of coming together to sort of back up the monitoring officer to a certain extent. So for me, it's how do we monitor and how do we know, or how do you know, whether some elected members are thinking differently about the monitoring officer? What would we expect to see? And then, you know, where exactly is the issue around sort of CMT not necessarily providing as much support for the monitoring officer? And I might be sort of putting words in your mouth there, but if you could sort of say what exactly is the issue there, that would be really helpful.
Well, I think, I'm not sure we can say exactly what the issue is at the moment. Okay, but we get a sense that there was. I mean, I think we want to wait until the stage 3 report to actually give you a definitive answer on that. And even that will be a triangulated view of different triangulated evidence around different people's subjective views about how that role is being supported and recognised and respected. Yeah. So can I wait till the December meeting to give you an answer on that?
I look forward to it. Can someone write it down so I don't forget?
Thank you. I've got Councillor Cuthbertson and then Councillor Fisher.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you for those comments, Mark, very helpful. I just want to, I think, sorry, can I ask if everybody's getting a pardon? Sounds like a bird twittering in the background here.
It's your hearing aid.
This is my hearing aid, all right, okay. I'll change those. Only got. I think that you move to learn about something and fix it by talking about it. So whenever I hear somebody say, "Oh, this is going to be a long job," I think to myself, so when's the first move going to be made? And I think I want to take up your point about it's about time somebody made the first move, really, certainly in the way of training. And it's interesting that I often go back to an event that happened nearly 50 years ago, when fairly early on, very early on in my career, I should say, when I was at a meeting which involved a number of civilian officers and some military personnel. And the meeting proceeded, because it was to do with software development and if you like, system requirements. And the lead person started off by saying, well, I think we should use first name terms here, and then proceeded to address everybody by the first names, nearly everybody. Because when he got to the 6th or 7th person down the other side of the room, he said, Bob. And Bob said, I prefer Major Kemney. I prefer Major Kemney, because that was the tradition in the head office of the department in Whitehall, which he'd experienced. And it was like having a bucket of cold water poured over everything. It took several weeks before that series of meetings got back on track. And it's always made me think, actually, if we're going to get some meetings going, if it were the Navy, for instance, you'd be having a cup of tea and sticky buns or stickies. And it's a great way of getting people to talk. Chocolate biscuits does, scones, whatever. But sharing some food, some drink, really oils the conversation. And that's the bit that we haven't had yet. Now, people may disagree with me.
Yeah.
Great rubbish, yeah. I don't have control of the budget for these things, of course. So I do think we shouldn't waste any time before getting at least an initial training session off the ground. And it doesn't need to be a bit of a training session with formal input. It could be people just talking about what do we think by some particular line of the code of conduct or member-officer relations, whatever. The sooner we do that, the sooner this problem will start to be being solved. And I can only say I regret that we're not making better progress on that. And I say that not from this authority's point of view, but from a situation where I've had to work with lots of people over a long period of time. And what was it Churchill said? I prefer George Orwell to war. Well, that pretty well sums it up for me.
Thanks, Councillor Cuthbertson. I apologise to anyone who's struggling to hear between the thunder outside and those slight technical issues we just had. But I think we managed to get all of that. I'm going to go to Councillor Fisher, and then Councillor Webb wants to come back in.
Thank you, Chair. I'm in a minority on this council, having served at another council, so I can perhaps bring a little bit of external appraisal to the way this council works. And I think point 2 is absolutely critical, developing the level of effective cross-party work. And we did move towards this at the last council meeting, where we agreed to set up a cross-party working group to see how we can improve. We've had one beautiful example of where this worked, which was when we were doing the massive job of reviewing the Constitution. We set up a cross-party group and we managed to thrash out, I think, all but 3 or 4 major items. We sat down, chaired by Councillor Lomas, his predecessor, and we actually worked cooperatively and constructively. And it was very, very effective, and we need to do more of that. The time to sort out our differences is not at full council, because people grandstand. It's inevitable. We can do it in small working parties, and I'm sure that would actually lead to better relations between the groups, because we would actually get things done in a more friendly manner. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Fisher. Having been a member of the committee when we looked at the output of the working party, I agree most of the points were dealt with, and the only reason why the remaining ones went to full council is because there was no agreement on the final points, which led to it inevitably having to go to full council for decision, because that's how decisions are made. Councillor Webb.
Thank you. My question might be, we're a bit limited because we don't have a monitoring officer with us tonight. Debbie, I don't know if you can help or if it's something we can feed back. It is around the training that we talked about. And if we look at section 6, part 1, the top of page 52, where it says, it is disappointing that the mandatory training around the new constitution does not yet appear to have happened. Quick question, is there a reason for that? And when is it going to happen? On the second paragraph, yes, we did agree that we would have annual sort of training on the code of conduct. So will that happen sort of this autumn? And on part 3 there, where it talks about how effective is the guidance now being provided with all meeting agendas to assist elected members in identifying conflict of interest. Where specifically is that guidance being provided to all members for all meetings? So for example, it's not in here, is it? So is that, am I missing it, or is it somewhere, does it need to be there?
Thanks, Debbie.
I can do my best on some of those. So yeah, I agree, it is disappointing that we've not got around to doing mandatory training. I think that's just been a capacity issue within the team. The work is ongoing. I've got an email here where my understanding is the training is going to be offered from September, so that this month, so it should be by the end of this month. I will chase that up and double check that it is going to be online this month, because that was certainly their plan. And there are various, you know, it's not just about a kind of sheep dip approach to getting people through training. It's general awareness raising. You know, we send out all staff emails from Ian as the Chief Operating Officer, so there's going to be awareness raising in those. We've got screens around the building, printers and things, going to be awareness, you know, issues raised on those. So there's going to be a bit of a campaign, if you like, for want of a better word. I think in terms of the point 2 about whether the code of conduct training has been redone, I am expecting it to be done, but I think I'll just wait for Bryn, the new monitoring officer, to arrive next week to confirm with him. I'm assuming it is in place and due to be done. Autumn's quite a vague term, isn't it? If you use central government's autumn, it can take you right up till January, can't it, actually? So, but I'll certainly go in and double check that. And then, yeah, you're right, Councillor Webb, the guidance around conflicts of interest hasn't yet been issued with every agenda. That was the plan. But I understood from Janie last week that that was going to be introduced from May. I'm not quite sure why, though, so I'll just double check that with people that are around now, and if that is the plan, again, I'll just check with Bryn if there's a reason why we can't do that straight away. I'm not quite sure if members are content to do that. We can start it straight away rather than waiting for the new administration in May. So I've got a few actions to go in and come back, and again, I'll send an email round.
Thanks, Debbie. Grateful for that, and I will also take that up with Bryn. He's coming into quite a list, isn't he? A to-do list, but that's good. And I think, you know, if there is a specific reason why we shouldn't send that guidance around with every agenda, then I think we'd want to understand that. And if not, I think we just want it to happen. I think that is the general consensus. There may be a specific reason, and in which case, you know, it'd be good to understand it. I've got a question mark around this. One of the things that came up when we were discussing the action plan around the public interest report and the sort of the main issue of declaring an interest, there was something that we couldn't really, we asked several times and we couldn't really kind of get a good understanding of. So you might be able to help us with it, and that is, if in preparation for a meeting, for example, this meeting, if one of us had been approached by the monitoring officer and told, you absolutely have a significant conflict of interest, it's prejudicial or it's pecuniary, you should not take part in this particular debate, and we chose to ignore that, as is our right to do, would there be an expectation that a monitoring officer, if they saw that there was a breach of the code of conduct happening in front of their very eyes, would you expect that they take any action about that? Because I think that we were left with the impression that actually the monitoring officer doesn't have any right to do anything about it or even say anything in the moment. And that, I think that felt quite uncomfortable for us all. If you can see a breach of the code happening in front of you, I think all of us as just, you know, citizens who take our responsibilities seriously, we'd expect somebody to do something about that. So I don't know if you can help us with that.
Probably not tonight, but I'll have a think about that. I mean, obviously, part of me would think, you know, that is what some of your new procedures should be saying about what would happen in that sort of circumstance. So I think that's one way of you testing out whether your current procedures and arrangements reflect that possibility, which is a realistic possibility sometime. But we have a monitoring officer on the team, so I'll ask her rather than me, who's not a monitoring officer, to give a view on that. Okay.
But I think that'd be really helpful and really useful for us in addressing some of those things that you were talking about in terms of that gap between officers and members. Is there anything else anyone wants to talk about, Councillor Fisher?
Thank you. I would also, we mentioned about when training takes place. I think the member induction programme is absolutely critical. I have to say, my time on council, it's a long time since I was last a member of council. I'm familiar with some things, but the training programme I got was not fit for purpose in my view. It needed to be much more thorough. And it wasn't up to scratch in 2019. There were a lot of new members. I think over half the council were new members. You know, we don't know what's going to happen next time, but I do think we need a much more effective, structured, and I would hope mandatory. Whether you can make it mandatory, what you do to a councillor who decides not to attend, I don't know, but I think it should be impressed on all members. They should attend all training sessions so they can hit the ground running. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Fisher. Mark.
Can I just say one thing? I think the City Council is doing very well at the moment is actually preparing for post-May 2023. So they are, your colleagues are developing, your officer colleagues are developing a good comprehensive programme of member induction and training, briefing and all that sort of stuff. There are two then questions, aren't there, about the quality of that training and who delivers that. And I think we're going to deliver some of that for you, not all of that, some of that for you. And secondly, is the attendance, isn't it? And whether people do turn up to it. And I think there's an individual responsibility there, isn't there, for individual members to turn up to that. But I think there's also a responsibility on you to encourage your colleagues to turn up to that. And most of you are part of political groupings. So you would hope that the political groups would almost mandate their members to make sure they turn up to those pieces of training.
Councillor Webb, is that supplementary or?
Yeah, does Helen want to come in?
Yeah, so I've got Councillor Webb and Joe who want to ask supplementary questions, but Helen, do you want to come in first?
Yes, thank you.
On the training.
I'll just come in on the member training just to give kind of reassurance. There is quite an extensive, well, there's a very extensive member training programme being developed at the moment. So what Councillor Fisher's talked about there in terms of what's mandatory, we are making an awful lot that's mandatory for all members, whether they're new members or existing members. And we're also doing a variety of different formats because we appreciate that not all electronic learning is the best ways of learning. So we're going to provide a number of different formats and different platforms to be able to access that. And it covers a wide range of things. So please be assured, I'm sat actually on the task and finish group for that member training. So there is an awful lot of hard work going in. So, yep, and we may well be looking at some members to look at it prior to launch of next year. So it might be a welcome for this committee to actually look at that as well. We can certainly introduce that. Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I just thought I'd interject with.
That's really helpful.
Point.
Thank you so much, Helen. And it sounds like you've also covered some of the things that Councillor Cuthbertson was raising earlier about having face-to-face and opportunities, maybe even to share a cup of tea and a bun. And I think it would be really helpful if we did get sight of that at this committee, obviously prior to the election period, because it was such a key part of the action plan, and I think it would be really helpful to have sight of that. So I've got Councillor Webb and then Joe.
Thank you. Just coming back on Councillor Fisher's point about there being lots of new members standing this time. I mean, let's be clear, the reason that this PIR happened was the Liberal Democrat leader, who was a very experienced councillor. So we go back to we're going around in circles around the issue of, we can do all the training, we deliver all the things, but is it going to get listened to? But my point is actually following on from what Helen's now said about the training. I think, again, on the fact that there's a lot of newer members at council. One of the things I think we have got a lot of in York is councillors who also have day jobs and work and are incredibly busy. And so it's just a plea for lots of notice for training events and options around times if possible. You know, if we're going into the next municipal cycle, I imagine that'll be the same, really, won't it? So it's just lots of notice. I mean, when Debbie said, oh, we're looking to get some training out by the end of September, I looked at my diary and thought, well, no, it just can't happen for me personally. But it's just one of those things. So it's a plea, really. Lots and lots of notice is helpful for all councillors for lots of different reasons. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Webb. Joe?
I think it's more the discussions we have here rather than the things that you're dealing with. But I think there is some relevance in that, which is, if you have this as a governance committee, and one of the problems has been described as a governance of the organisation problem, then why not have a regular paper after the election, which tells you this is the training which all members are expected to take, and these are the members who have taken which block of training. In other words, you have a regular report as to where you are. It's not then up to this committee, I don't think, to be responsible for doing anything about it, but it's a public document, and it would then put some pressure on groups, presumably, to either agree the training should happen or start talking to council officers about how inappropriate the training seems to be turning out to be. Because just because something is declared to be mandatory doesn't mean it's any good. So if councillors start thinking something isn't working, then maybe the issue has to be reviewed. But nevertheless, if you set out a matrix and say that'll be a regular paper to the Audit and Governance Committee, you've given a control mechanism for how it moves forward. And I think related to that as well, because of pressure, could any of the modules be offered to all of the existing councillors before the election? And yes, some of them wouldn't be there after the election, but to enable them to have ticked off some of those modules if and when they are re-elected, and actually spreading the burden. So you don't try to get all of it thrown in at you because you're re-elected in May. If you could have done some of it before May, because you'll have all sorts of other pressures, you know, come the outcome of the election.
Thanks, Joe. Some helpful things, I think, to take forward there. Debbie?
Yeah, it's a really timely discussion because, like Helen and I, am also on the task and finish group, and we've got a meeting tomorrow. So I can certainly feed a lot of these issues back to that group. As you can imagine, it's a wide range of officers involved, it's a wide range of topics. So the logistics, you know, I don't envy the person that's going to sit down and try and plot this all in with everybody's diaries, because it is going to be incredibly difficult. But I think it is a really helpful suggestion to think about, you know, starting it earlier and allowing a longer period. So not saying to members you've got to get it all done by a certain date, but allowing that period of, you know, bedding in and getting the training done by a certain time, or at least prioritising it to say these things need to be done first. So I'll take all that back to the task and finish group and we can feed back.
Thank you. Mark, is there anything you wanted to say, sort of in conclusion, anything you wanted to pick up on?
No, I thought that was a very positive and helpful conversation. Actually, some very helpful comments, I think, which will make me think more clearly about the stage 3 report. So we may come across some of you when we come on site, probably for a day in maybe October, although I'm looking at my diary for October as well. We'll have to see how that's manageable. And as I said, the final report will be the one I think you need to take even more notice of, and we'll give you some clear recommendations on some further steps you can take.
Yeah. And thank you, and thank colleagues from the LGA as well for the work you've done around this. It has, I think, been incredibly valuable to us. Okay, so I'm mindful of time. I know we've been going for a little while. We have a couple more items on the agenda, which I anticipate will be much shorter than the preceding one. So if everybody's content, I'm going to carry on rather than take a break. But please feel free to contradict me if you need to have a break. I'm very conscious that, you know, these days can be long and we can tire or need comfort. Okay, so we'll carry on. Thank you, everybody. The next item is the paper on exit strategies. Members who are continuing on the committee will recall we have looked at this previously. At the time when we looked at it previously, that it was one of the recommendations from the Public Interest Report Action Plan. We looked at it, and at the time we looked at it, the guidance, the central guidance on exit strategies was being consulted on. So we looked at this at an earlier point in time on the basis of what we expected the recommendations to be. And the prediction was a good one, because it turns out the recommendations were as predicted. So this is essentially bringing this report back to the committee to say it is now in line with the official recommendations and guidance on exit strategies. And thank you to officers for correctly predicting that and saving us that piece of work. So I just wanted to give some context and a reminder for those of us who weren't there last time round that this is a piece of work we've scrutinised previously. Debbie, is there anything that you want to add, or Helen, is there anything?
If Helen wants to add anything, I haven't got anything to add.
Helen?
Thank you, Chair. And that was a lovely introduction and pretty much what I was going to say. It certainly has been in front of you before. We had the foresight to be able to use the guidance that was when it was in draft, and that draft guidance has not changed, and therefore our provision that we put in place is actually just being confirmed. So this is just more confirmation for yourselves as a committee, and if you've got any questions, I'm certainly happy to take them. But I would say genuinely this should not raise any concerns with you. We're abiding by the policy because we put it in first, and just for your information, we haven't had any special severance payments at all since it's been implemented.
Thank you so much, Helen. Any members got any questions, queries about this? No, and thank you again to the officers for foresight in saving us from having to do that piece of work twice. So we move on to the agenda item 7. Again, this is something which we have already dealt with on full council. So prior to the last full council meeting, the monitoring officer asked permission to take some amendments to the constitution directly to full council and not bring them before this committee first, because that would have significantly delayed them getting approved at full council. One of the things that we noted at full council was that actually the requirement to make some technical adjustments was actually a really good thing, because it meant that people were actually looking at the constitution, and that's a really positive thing, I think. But nevertheless, some minor amendments were needed, some for technical reasons because of things that changed outside of our constitutional framework, and required then changes to be made to the constitution to keep it in line with external legislation and guidance. And some were things that came as sort of technical or procedural issues from the groups and committees themselves, because they needed minor amendments to be made in order to improve their functioning. So this went before and was approved by the last full council, but it's brought here for completeness so that if members have any questions or queries about it, then we can raise those and examine them. Any questions, queries? Councillor Cuthbertson.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome the constitution changes in general. There's one specific change that I will be querying because I believe it fetters the discretion and the ability of a director to act in the company's interest, which is what they're there to do under the Companies Act.
Can you tell us, Councillor Cuthbertson?
Yes, I'm
where
just
you are?
about to.
Yeah.
It's on page 115, the table. It's terms of reference 4.1, and it's table entry B, where the chair of the committee is established to undertake one of the in one particular function, which is to approve or make amendments to strategic or business plans. And I suggest that that's actually the role of a director and not of the owner of the company. So
Councillor
I'm not-
Cuthbertson, that isn't something that has been changed.
No.
That's something that was in the updated constitution that we passed in May.
I'm not suggesting it has, but in May, I'd had very short notice that I will be taking on a different role. And since receiving these minutes, I've looked at it rather more closely than I did. So I intend to raise that. I may in the future turn around and say, well, actually, you better ignore that. But I do think it's a problem. And I think that it will benefit from a discussion with the monitoring officer.
Marvellous. So we'll add that to our incoming monitoring officers list, so that we make sure that you can pick that up with him and address that issue. Is there anything else that anybody wanted to raise? No? Okay, thank you. We move then to the last item on our agenda, which is item 8, which is our work plan. So at every meeting, we look at our work plan, we look at what's happening, where it needs to be slotted in. Do we have meetings in the right places in the year to address everything? So there are a few things I wanted to bring to the committee's attention. Our next meeting was scheduled to be on the 19th of October, and you'll see there are a number of items there. However, many of those items are updates that we have periodically through the year. And as we discussed earlier in the agenda, the key corporate risks, Monitor 1 and Monitor 2, essentially have been taken as one today, so that wouldn't be required. Our monitoring officer will have had scant weeks in his post and is unlikely to be producing a comprehensive monitoring officer report in time for the agenda. And I think that in terms of the audit progress report, that is coming back in November. So we're recommending that we remove that additional meeting that we'd put into the calendar. If you recall, when we set the calendar for the year, we remove that one. I'm also reminding members that although we have done our best to put the November meeting to the latest possible point in the month that we can put it, because it's on the last day of the month, it may be that in the lead up to that meeting, we need to move it if the auditor's report on the accounts is not going to be available in line with the schedule for issuing papers. So with your permission, I'm going to remove the October meeting from the schedule because all of the items on there are going to be, they're either being addressed or are on subsequent meeting agendas, and we will keep a close eye with Mazars on the progress of the audit report, and if there is an issue, we'll of course contact members as soon as possible around that. Councillor Cuthbertson.
Thank you, Chair. Before we decide on this, can I just check what frequency the key corporate risk report appears? I thought it was quarterly.
Yeah, it usually is quarterly, but we had to move it, didn't we, we've had some sort of shuffling around of the
Yeah,
meetings, and then
we
that didn't
did.
quite fit in with our quarterly. So we've gone a bit off piste really in terms of the
Yeah.
timing, and we haven't stuck to the strict quarters. So the one you received today was just the latest update.
Yeah.
So it was like quarter one and a bit, really.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, if we have the next one, which will be in January, that will be the kind of quarter three. So you've had a combined 1 and 2 today, and you'll get a quarter 3 in January.
So rather than having one this month and then one next month, we have one this month and then one in January, which is more of a quarterly schedule than one this month and one next month.
It's this one that's late.
Yeah.
That's why we've sort of got a bit out of sync.
Okay, yes, all right, thank you. Well, the second point I wanted to raise is, I would hope that we could get a report on progress on training and,
Yes.
if you like, development of exposure of the code of conduct, etc., and member officer relations before this committee as soon as possible. It looks as if the November meeting might be rather full, and I'm just wondering if you want to rethink that move to abandon October.
Yeah, I think it doesn't prevent us from receiving a report before the next meeting. There's nothing stopping officers from providing us with you know, that outline of training, and we can feed back into it. The October meeting was an additional meeting we put in case we hadn't been able to cover everything. We have, and what we're saying is we have covered everything we need to. So we're intending to remove it because the ordinary schedule of audit and governance meetings isn't monthly, but we had ended up, because we were being cautious and trying to give ourselves space. I think learning from last year when we were doing lots and lots of work on the Constitution, we seemed to have a meeting every other week at one point. It wasn't every other week, I am exaggerating. But I think we put extra dates in the calendar to almost reserve them, and saying that we'd rather cancel ones that weren't needed than try to find additional dates, because that can be very challenging in the corporate calendar to make sure that members aren't required to be in 2 places at once, which I know is very challenging.
I think my concern is that November is going to be a very full discussion with the 3 major items on the agenda, which then means that the next meeting will be late-ish January. And of course, we've got a new year starting 8 or 9 weeks after that. So I just don't want us to lose track of keeping progress going.
Yeah.
I don't welcome meetings for the sake of meetings. I just feel that there's a need for this case. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Cuthbertson. Any further points? Councillor Webb?
Yeah, I just think I'd follow on from that. We are slightly slaves to external factors as to when the reports have been finished, when the treasury management has been done, when audits have been done. So that's kind of part of the reason that, yes, on audit and governance, we end up with some meetings which seem ridiculous in terms of their agendas, but it's just been the way it's been, hasn't it, really? But yeah.
Councillor Cuthbertson.
Thank you, Chair. Now, I'm picking up Joe's point about treating this committee as an organisation which monitors and seeks assurance rather than reassurance.
Yes.
And I think that the question of the training that's been agreed that's following the PIR is something on which we need to assure ourselves that something is actually happening.
Absolutely.
Not find out next June that, okay, we've got a series of meetings planned for next year. I hope I don't make that point in a reasonable way. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, of course. Thanks, Councillor Cuthbertson. And I think one of the points that Joe started with at the beginning, first contribution was a perler, to make sure that when we do have recommendations that come out of the discussions that we have, that we then follow up, have a control mechanism so that we follow up on those. You know, we've agreed that we'll go and it will be something we'll take up with the incoming monitoring officer to make sure we have a process in place for that, so that we absolutely can make sure that when we've talked about something and we've said it is very important that this is progress is made on this, that we actually are then checking on that and making sure and deciding, is that something we can now say, okay, we're satisfied, or is it something that we need further monitoring or input on? Joe?
Everything like that needs a name. It needs a person who is accountable, and it needs a time, the expected date at which that person will report back. If they miss the time, they need to tell you why they've missed the time, what's changed, and when they are. It has to be a very active feedback that we're given by people. You pass the responsibility specifically. It's not just someone at the time, it's cleared with the chair of the committee who the specific person is, and it then appears on your control documentation. The person X is dealing with the issue that you've raised, and it'll come back on your monitoring the progress.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Fisher.
It might be an appropriate time while we have Mark in the room. I notice there's nothing on here about the next stage of the LGA review. I just wondered if you had any possible timescale as to when the next level of that will be ready for us to digest.
I think Mark did tell us that the report is likely to be by the end of the year.
End of the
so
year, right,
we'll
sorry, I
then
understand.
look at it in the January meeting, if it is there by the end of the year.
Okay, thank you.
I'm just checking with Mark for anyone watching at home. I'm checking with Mark, who's sitting at the back of the room, and making sure I'd got that timeline right. So, and he's nodding, so we're good. Okay. So if we are content, then we will, the next meeting then will be our November meeting. We will make sure that all of the things that we've all raised and discussed today are given appropriate reporting back, and that we particularly take up the useful suggestion with our incoming monitoring officer. And I apologise to him for adding so much to his to-do list before he's even started, to make sure we have, you know, where I work outside of my council work, for every meeting we have an action log which absolutely covers what actions have come out of the meeting, who's going to do them, by when, how it's going to be reported back. And I think a system like that for audit and governance would help us all, not only in keeping track of the things that we're concerned about and actively looking at, but also in making sure that we're not bringing things back to meetings before we've had chance to actually do any work on it, and before we've got all the information or resources we might need in order to track it. Joe?
Just a shorty, and encourage your colleagues who chair other committees to see that they have these kind of control mechanisms in, because if they've got them in place and in monitor, less will end up here.
Thanks very much, Joe. Absolutely agree. So as there is no urgent business, our meeting is closed. Thank you all very much, and thank you, Joe. Sterling contribution for your first meeting with us, and I'm sure that bodes well